Great. And I wanted to do a shout out to Marcy Williams. I just saw her in one of the boxes. She's disappeared now, but Marcy, welcome, and it's great to see you. It's actually great to see everybody. Good evening to you and welcome to this, what we're calling an inaugural webinar hosted by the John Joseph Moakley Chair of Peace and Reconciliation at the even greater John W. McCormack School of Policy and Global Studies here at UMass Boston. My name is Rita Kiki Ido. I am the interim dean of the school, and I have the privilege of introducing our three guests today. First is our moderator. He is Parag O'Malley, the John Joseph Moakley Chair, Distinguished Professor of Peace and Reconciliation here at the McCormack School. The Moakley Chair, let me tell you a little bit about it. It's an integral part of the McCormack School's disciplinary offerings. The chair was established in 2006 to honor the memory of the late Congressman, John Joseph Moakley, who represented South Boston in Congress from 1973 until his death in 2001. As President Ronald Reagan's envoy to El Salvador, Congressman Moakley uncovered the Salvadorian military's role in the murder of 6 Jesuit priests, if you remember that story. Their housekeeper was killed, and so was their daughter in 1989 during a brutal civil war there. As a result, Congress cut off aid to El Salvador, forcing the military to the negotiating table and bringing the conflict to an end, monitoring the subsequent peace accord to ensure compliance with measures to guarantee human rights have become a pivotal part of the John Moakley legacy. A close confidant of Moakley is Professor O'Malley, who has worked in numerous conflict areas and across democratic transitions for over 50 years, most notably in Northern Ireland, South Africa, and Iraq. He is the author of several books on Northern Ireland, South Africa, and the Middle East. His unique collection of 15 years of interviews with South Africans of every political persuasion during the transition from to democratic transformation is actually hosted on the Nelson Mandela Organization's website. Parag is the founding editor of McCormack's New England Journal of Public Policy. He's also founded the Forum for Cities in Transition, which is dedicated to the principle that one divided society is the best position to help another. And most recently, he founded acronym stands for the Global Alliance of Muslims for Equality, to help young Muslims navigate the challenges they face in a post-ISIS Europe and the United States. Parag's forthcoming book, coming out soon, everyone, is The Pearls and Prospects of a United Ireland, and it will be published in March 2023. So let me welcome Parag for hosting this inaugural event. Thank you, Parag. This is going to be exciting.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Thank everybody for being here.
Absolutely. Would you like me to go ahead and introduce our two panelists?
Yes, if you could do that, please.
I would love to, because we have two distinguished panelists with us this evening. They are Charles Strozier and David, or Dave, he calls himself, Turman. Let me talk a little bit about their fascinating bios. Charles Strozier is a professor emeritus of history at John Jay College and the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and a practicing psychoanalyst. His latest book, published with Pinterest, Kelly, and Scher, is The New World of Self, subtitled Heinz Kohut's Transformation of Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, published by Oxford. He is the author of this book. Heinz Kohut himself, a bio on the making of a psychoanalysis, published in 2001 by Farah, Strauss, and Giraud. He's got a the paperback version with Other Press in the spring of 2004, and it's now been translated into 3 languages: Italian, Japanese, and Hebrew, with also a translation in Mandarin in progress. Fascinating. He's also the author of Apocalypse, The Psychology of Fundamentalism in America. Wow, that's an interesting one, given today's insurrectionists. But that was published in Beacon Press, 1994. He's also the author of Lincoln's Quest for Union, a psychological portrait, which is published by Paul Dry Books in 2001. He's got many published and about 100, separate articles. Welcome, Charles Strozier, to the panel. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Let me also now introduce our second panelist, David M. Terman, who is an MD, and he is a past director of the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis, where he had been a training and supervising analyst for over 50 years. I'm going to wait for Dr. Terman to come up. Yep. Dr. Terman had his undergraduate and medical education at the University of Chicago and his psychoanalytic training at the Chicago Institute for Psychoanalysis. He has been one of the analysts who helped develop the work of Heinz Kohut and what has become known as self-psychology. He has contributed to several central aspects of clinical and developmental theory. He reconceptualized the Oedipus complex in self-psychological terms, and he was one of the first to note the importance of positive experience informing psychological structure in development. He has also explored the history of anti-Semitism, very important to today. Perhaps in Q&A we can talk about some other things like the increasing anti-Semitism in our politics in 2022. But he has explored the history of anti-Semitism from a self-psychological perspective, and David has co-authored and edited a book with Charles Strozier, who is our panelist, as well as James Jones, on the psychology of fundamental and other political and social forces. The name of that book is called The Fundamentalist Mindset, and it was published by Oxford University Press in 2010. David has also applied his work on a paranoia to an understanding of some of the features of classic psychoanalytic theory. He is now retired from clinical practice, but continues to teach, supervise, and write in the area of applied psychoanalysis, and do things like this, sharing his knowledge to us, to this audience in our special inaugural seminar called Inside Putin's Head. So welcome all three, Parag, Chuck, I think he likes to be called, and Dave, who likes to be called. Take it from there. I'm handing it over to you, Parag.
Thank you, Kiki. Thank you very much. As I said, there was a news flash just before we started. Say that Ukrainian drones attacked military bases hundreds of miles inside Russia, bringing a different kind of resonance to our discussion. Everyone may recall that Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 in what Vladimir Putin called a special military operation with the aim of demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine. He questioned Ukraine's right to exist, asserted that Ukraine was governed by neo-Nazis, persecuted the ethnic Russian minority. The invasion was supposed to be relatively quick, a blitz-like ground assault from multiple directions, a quick push to Kiev, the capital, overthrowing the government and installing Russian puppets. Instead, under the leadership of President Zelensky, the Ukrainian military mounted fierce resistance. For Europe, it is a new Cold War. The countries of Europe, seeing the threat of a Russian presence on their borders, pledged to help Ukraine with whatever it needed to repel Russia. Immediately, there were sanctions on Russia, with Europe swearing off Russian oil that had fueled their economies and sending energy prices soaring across the continent. Sweden and Finland applied for membership of NATO. And the United States vastly increased supplies of military hardware to Ukraine, especially sophisticated missile interceptors and short-range precision missiles. At every turn as the war progressed, the Russians suffered setbacks. Putin redefined his territorial aims to capturing and holding the Donbass region. 4 areas were annexed, 6 elections held, and their territory declared to be part of the Russian Federation. Even here, Putin suffered setbacks, having to evacuate the key city of Kherson a month ago. As the war progressed, Putin redefined its purpose. It slowly evolved into a narrative that posited it as a war between Russia, civilization, and a corrupt cosmopolitan West out to destroy it, a war between good and evil. Putin's response to every setback has been to escalate the war on a different front, most notably with massive missile attacks on the Ukrainians' electricity and transportation infrastructure in response to the bombing of the Kerch Bridge that links Crimea to Ukraine. And after Ukraine recaptured, I should say, Kherson, he responded with a barrage of over 100 missiles hitting targets across Ukraine and leaving 10 million people without electricity. Far more worrying was the missile landing on Polish soil, killing 2 on November 15th. Fortunately, it was one, if we can use such a word, turned out to be a Ukrainian interceptor that went astray. President Joe Biden has promised to defend every inch of NATO territory. The margin for error is infinitesimal. If transgressed, the results could be apocalyptic. With each Russian escalation, the West has escalated in response. At one point, Putin announced that he would use all means at his disposal to defend Russian territory, and he did not rule out a nuclear strike on Ukraine. Just weeks ago, William Burns, director of the CIA, met his Russian counterpart in Ankara, where he spelled out in blunt detail the scope and breadth of a NATO response to any use of a nuclear device by Russia. All means at his disposal to defend Russian territory has now been breached just today with that drone by Ukrainian drones on territory miles, hundreds of miles, not just inside, but hundreds of miles inside Russia. Indeed, Putin has accused Ukraine getting ready to drop a dirty nuclear device on its territory and put the blame on Russia. Since the summer months, the threat of a nuclear strike has been more frequently aired in Russian state propaganda. What seems unreal to us is being pumped into the Russian mainstream. On the battlefield, Russia's losses have been huge. Over 300,000 reservists were mobilized. Seas of young men fleeing Russia rather than serve reinforced perceptions in the West that the war was unpopular in Russia, that the reservists sent to Ukraine with minimum training were cannon fodder for the battle-hardened Ukrainian army. Putin has now resorted to what I call the Aleppo strategy under General Sergei Surovikin, essentially bomb Ukraine back to the Stone Age. Relentless missile attacks and drone attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, on electricity grids, dams, waterworks, sewage treatment plants, thermal power stations, hospitals, schools, and whatever moves. Winter is coming now, meaning stalled military operations as mud and snow make advances and retreats more difficult to stall altogether. Winter has defeated Napoleon and Hitler. On whose side is winter in Ukraine? Which side has the better winter clothing? Among the questions we have for our guests are, what does a cycle of response lead to when each side meets an escalation of the war with a disproportionate escalation of its own? As long as the West hangs together and the US continues to supply more sophisticated hardware to Ukraine, and Ukraine is convinced it is winning, is there any incentive to negotiate a settlement? By all accounts, it appears Putin is losing this war. With any acknowledgement of defeat on his part or gesture of a willingness to negotiate pose an existential threat to his own existence and a humiliation that would crush his ego, leading him to do the once unthinkable. What are Putin's options? And do we in the West miscalculate how we evaluate his options? Because we and he see the world through different prisms of reality. In the West, we question whether Putin is a rational actor. We fail to understand that in his world, moving in the direction of a nuclear strike may be a perfectly rational choice. The threat of a nuclear strike in Ukraine and whatever retaliation the West might inflict has been met in the public arena with studied indifference. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, when people across the world were terrified that Armageddon was about to annihilate the human race, are we sleepwalking, either through miscalculation, miscommunication, or just almost accidentally into Armageddon? These are some of the questions for Charles and for Dave. Both, as you heard from Dean Kiki Edozie, are uniquely qualified to provide the kind of psychoanalytic insights into Putin's personality that will guide our discussion this evening. Which of you would like to lead off?
I'm going to start, and thank you for your introduction, Kiki, and that lead into our presentation. We're going to be a kind of a tag team. So Dave is my close friend, and we've been working on this for a long time. And we'll go back and forth in our presentation, if that's okay. But I will start. And you touched on a lot of important issues there, Parag, in your introduction, and our focus is on, as you were indicating at the end, an attempt to understand Putin's psychology, and to particularly in relationship to nuclear weapons, and some work, a work that we're working on for many years on the fundamentalist mindset. So I'm going to start. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Putin has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons. And those around him have threatened to use nuclear weapon. Such threats take us into a unfamiliar political and psychological realm. The danger is not just large-scale destruction, which has already occurred, but the total collapse of human civilization. This is a new level of threat. The possibility of using nuclear weapons introduces into what is really an old-fashioned war in Eastern Europe, an apocalyptic image of the end of life as we know it. Sort of even at the regional level, Russian threats pose great dangers. Keep in mind that a bomb the size of the one dropped on Hiroshima would today be considered small and tactical. If dropped on Kyiv, a city of nearly 3 million people, at least before the war, it would have catastrophic consequences. Nuclear weapons also brings with them the contamination. This is one of the things that, of course, happened in Hiroshima. The contamination of radiation that lasts for generations. There's an additional way in which the way nuclear threat has gotten introduced into the war in Ukraine, that it has a kind of a psychological resonance with the fears of COVID that we've all been struggling with for the last 2.5 years. And with COVID, there's the unconscious fear of invisible malignant penetration, which resonates psychologically with this new threat of nuclear weapons that has been specifically introduced to the war. So Putin has taken maximum strategic advantage of both fears. As Robert J. Lifton and Richard Falk have argued, going back to the middle of the Cold War, back in 1982, repeated threats to use nuclear weapons are themselves a form of weapon use. And I think that's a very important, the nuclear weapons are being used simply by the threat to use them. And they profoundly, such threats profoundly distort democratic institutions in fundamental ways. Given his autocratic power in Russia, Putin's talk must be taken seriously. His threats are not simply loose rhetoric. He has had his army kill civilians as it seizes territory in the Donbass region and beyond. The West doesn't dare impose a no-fly zone and provide all the sophisticated weapons that Zelensky wants, and yet there has been extensive delivery of weapons so far. The West, the United States and Biden and NATO have tried to walk a fine line between providing what is really kind of massive support and yet drawing the line at something like a no-fly zone that might provoke a much wider war. The dread is that the actual defeat of Russian forces would humiliate Putin personally, and backed into a corner, he could well unleash nuclear weapons. This is not an idle fear. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave now.
Okay, thanks, Chuck, and thanks for beginning our exposition here. And thank you, Kiki, for that lovely introduction. and Baring, thank you for inviting us. So I'm going to turn more to being an analyst and not being the wonderful, sophisticated historian that my colleague Chuck is, bringing in a more psychoanalytic point of view to our discussion. We are both, of course, deeply, our professional lives have been deeply immersed in trying to understand the nature of interhuman experience, and it's from that point of view that we try to look at Putin and Putin's psychology, and particularly what we have determined is his paranoia, and we'll expand on that, and its relationship to what Heinz Kohut called the group self is of particular interest to us. The group self, start with that, is a psychological structure shared by members of a group. It consists of common goals and ideals that have been born out of historical experience. The group self can describe the psychological relationship that develops between a leader and the group, and in this particular case, between a paranoid, charismatic leader and his followers in this particular time, in the time of historical crisis. We know something about Putin's psychology from his frequent speeches and press conferences since his rise to power in the 1990s. He seems to believe, and he does believe, that his own propaganda that NATO is about to attack Russia, and that his war is a war of defensive survival. He talks constantly of enemies surrounding the country and feeling that the West is encroaching. Putin's behavior fits logically into what appears to be an enactment of what we have called the paranoid gestalt. Let me tell you what we mean by that. We have observed this particular psychological organization or structure in both individuals and groups. Its origins, that is the paranoid gestalt's origins, and causes are in experiences of damage to the self of either the individual or the group. It is a kind of damage that crushes the pride of the individual or the group, and particularly with the group, it's a damage that besmirches its ideals and ideologies, a challenge to their ideals and ideologies. We call that damage humiliation. And the consequences of humiliation, of such an injury, of the injury to the self, either of the individual or the group, is an inability to admit that any kind of weakness or failure is the fault of oneself. That cannot be. It must be the doing of another. And any challenge to the individuals or groups' central beliefs, their ideologies, is similarly an essential blow to either the individual self or the group self. All such terrible weaknesses, threats are seen to be the work of another, of the other, and particularly the evil other. There's a gestalt that emerges. It's almost like a algebraic equation almost that you can apply in many situations in history. And it goes as follows. One, the I or we as a group are perfect. In the extension of that perfection I'll mention in a minute. The I or we as a group are in danger from the evil other who is trying to destroy us through humiliation. And in the group, the group experience of the grandiosity that I am perfect and wonderful is expressed as a utopian goal. That is, we as a group, this beleaguered group, is trying to establish a perfect world, either a religious perfect world, a heaven on earth, the second coming, Sharia, whatever, or a secular perfect world, the workers' paradise, for example. in any event, we are trying to establish some kind of perfect world, and the only obstacle to its realization is the evil other. And the only way then to achieve the utopia is the destruction or extermination of the evil other. The particular nature of the utopian vision for the group may be molded and articulated by the leader, but it may also come out of group, out of historical group factors. So that's what we call the paranoid gestalt. So going back to Putin, we can certainly say that he's surrounded himself with yes men who applaud this grandiose vision and who also inflame his feelings about the evilness of the West. He's throttled the press, cut off dissent, and has limited the marketplace for alternative ideas. He may also have been affected by the pandemic, we speculate. He seems to have responded with fear and dread to COVID, you know, those long tables that he sits at with either foreign advisors or even people in his own administration, the long tables that separate him from any other human contact. That distance suggests that he has an exaggerated fear of contamination. And so we can add to the mix of the humiliation that was in his personal life and in his professional, in his adult life. We could add to that mix the anxiety about dying from COVID. To help us understand Putin's worldview, we think that Timothy Snyder, who you all probably know is this wonderful Russian historian, has brought attention to our attention to the significance of the philosopher Ivan Ilyin, who was a white Russian emigre who in the 20th century, who wrote lots and lots of books. And what he essentially was describing was a fascist political order in which Russia is historically innocent and surrounded by evil. In Ilyin's view, it is Russia's mission to safeguard civilization and, quote, the good by producing a great leader, i.e. Putin, who will save Russia and vanquish the evil other, i.e. the West. It's a perfect formulation of the paranoid gestalt in Ilyin's work. And you probably know, that Putin, they had Ilyin's remains disinterred, I think was from Switzerland, and reinterred in Red Square in Moscow with much fanfare and much ceremony, which it was part of the indication of the importance and the influence that Ilyin's thought has had on them. The framework, as I say, informs Putin's understanding of and experience of Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. And that experience is being caught up in unrelenting and ongoing humiliation. His read of history is that the West has gloated over winning the Cold War and has successively picked off many of the former Soviet republics as Western puppets. NATO has extended its reach to the border of Russia, which has gotten even worse now with the war. And while the United States has arrogantly and intolerably grabbed the world's wealth. This discourse of aggrievement seems, roams into wild fantasies of Russia's right to imperial ambitions in Ukraine, as we've seen, and the profound humiliation that set in at the sudden loss of empire and the aggravating economic and social chaos of the 90s fueled this worldview. In time, Russia's recovered economically, but the humiliation of the loss of the empire and of its former hegemony became a deep wound, certainly for Putin personally, and probably also inflamed many average Russians. He regards Ukraine, as we know, as a fake state that historically remains an integral part of sacred Mother Russia. Thank you, Ilyin. As the Russian scholar Tatiana Stanovaya, argued recently in the New York Times, Putin considers the Ukrainian language a mere dialect of Russia and imagines that in the near future a Russification of the country that would include a purge of its elites, dethroning of its national heroes, renaming the streets, rewriting its history, etc. And Putin lays out such ideas with absolute certainty, which is, of course, the hallmark of a paranoid personality. Putin's denunciations of the West connects with a very deep strain in Russian history, going back before Peter the Great. His grandiose vision for a great Russian civilization that obliterates Ukrainian identity and is on its way to vanquishing the decadent and evil West is part of that vision. It is an open question whether such views represent most Russians in a psychological sense, though it may not matter. Perhaps Putin's vision speaks to an unconscious aspect of many Russians' feelings, although that's quite more elusive. Historically, paranoid leaders of Russia have extended the empire and expanded steadily over the centuries. And Russians have seemed to be content to let them do what they want. But that is until the empire collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Okay, back to you, Chuck.
So paranoia and millennialism, in other words, share a common psychological basis of what we've written about as the fundamentalist mindset. Now, mostly, too often, really, scholars have written a lot about fundamentalism, but restricted it to the religious context. And our effort, which we first formulated in the book of that title, was to think about in the political and historical realm the same categories of that we're more familiar with in the religious realm occurring in the political realm. And particularly this convergence of paranoia and millennialism, such a mindset, fundamentalist mindset, involves thinking in rigid dualistic categories. A sense of the evil other lies at the heart of fundamentalism. The world is a dangerous place that is devoid of empathy. We are not all in it together. The evil can take a variety of forms to fit the historical moment. For Putin, the West embodies degradation, corruption, and lustful impulses that threaten traditional Russian values, even though in holding these views, he is out of sync with many Russians who are yearning for the very freedoms he disdains. Putin's belief is that his true Russia represents the good that must deal with evil. Such a Manichaean distinction reduces the struggle to a binary choice between an idealized good Russia and the bad West. It is the nature of the fundamentalist mindset to totalize the difference between good and evil. And totalism is a very interesting, important concept psychologically that Robert J. Lifton has written most about. And it's the crucial process of making something relatively manageable in the public space by creating great rivalries that spawn paranoia and violence and keep hatreds burning bright. Rage becomes chronic and ingrained. The other, deemed evil in what emerges as a radical fundamentalist, in a radical fundamentalist mindset, comes to embody the taint of sin. That other must be dispensed with. And in fact, his elimination assumes something of an ethical obligation to achieve perfection in the world. To kill, therefore, is to heal. And in this context, one could even say that killing makes one a savior. Violence becomes a moral, and violence of war and invasion becomes a moral imperative, lending what is typically an apocalyptic cause a profoundly important and powerful ethical dimension. The fundamentalist mindset requires an apocalyptic mission of the group. The perfect world will be reborn in an imagined future created by the select few. The remnant in the Book of Revelation, the Nazis in Germany, the true Muslims for ISIS, etc. The evil must be exterminated to initiate the violent process of renewal. Injury to the group's sense of self in the form of loss of power, discrediting of its ideology, or economic and political deterioration results in shame, humiliation, and rage in the group. The humiliation, most of all, that's central to this experience, historical experience, is the humiliation that is intolerable. The most dangerous form of paranoid violence is the response to a feeling of heightened victimization by the other. Feeling shamed and fearful that one's very essence is about to be destroyed, the paranoid leader attacks to ward off the imagined danger posed by the other and restore the integrity of the damaged self. The paranoid leader is exquisitely sensitive to what he, and it's almost always a he historically, experiences as an injury or humiliation. That attitude lies at the heart of the violent potential within paranoia. And in Putin's case, it seems to have motivated him to start a war without any provocation. Now, I think I'm going to skip one can see these dynamics very much with the case of the Nazis of Hitler and the Nazis, which is in some ways the perfect expression of what we're trying to talk about, playing out with Putin. So, Dave, why don't you end up?
Okay. So what can we do? What could we possibly do in this situation? The possibilities are slim, but nonetheless, we want to try to articulate some of them. As Chuck said, the humiliation is at the heart of the intersection of paranoia and millennialism. The nature of Putin's apocalyptic vision and of the war he has unleashed makes defeat unacceptable. It would represent a massive humiliation. His fundamentalist worldview is an extreme, is so extreme that it doesn't allow for compromise. The very goodness of the world, himself, and most significantly of Russia, and are at stake. Defeat would shatter the foundation of his elaborate belief system, not to mention his own self. There's nothing more absolute for the fundamentalist leader than not retreating from a field of battle that has assumed apocalyptic meaning. Suicide is the only option, as Hitler came to feel, watching the destruction of his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. Putin has given himself a choice Hitler lacked, unfortunately. He need not accept defeat on the battlefield, as others in history have done, whether it be Cornwallis or Napoleon or Lee or anybody else. But surrender of defeated armies in 45, surrender of defeated armies in the field has always been in the nature of warfare, often reversing and almost always reversing and undoing the apocalyptic visions of the paranoid leaders against who have often lost those wars. But an awareness of the psychological vulnerabilities of Putin in Ukraine could help. Oh wait, but there's one thing. The surrender, but nuclear options radically change that equation. An awareness of psychological vulnerabilities of Putin in the Ukraine could help possibly offset the possibility that he would actually use nuclear weapons. His aggression needs to be stopped, but Russia can't be humiliated or backed into a corner in the process. There may be hope in the very grandiosity of Putin's imperial dreams. He imagines hegemony over a vast territory and influence on a geopolitical scale. Ukraine is only one piece of that larger vision. Russia may feel that it has preserved a respected role in any final settlement, including the shared need to preserve human civilization. That is appealing to the larger vision, may be one possibility. But most of all, I think we must engage in continuous negotiations and have as much contact with Putin as possible. It is possible in the very process of discussion and exchange, we could possibly convey a sense of respect for the man that could serve to bolster his threatened and endangered self, however heinous his deeds and however horrible this war. While we should remain firm and support Ukraine in its war with Russia, we could, in personal exchange, convey not rage and threat, but on some level of understanding of his position, however much the realistic effects of the policies are destructive and threatening to civilization. We would take exception to the idea that negotiations or supporting Ukraine's war are a binary choice. That is, we say it isn't a question of either negotiations or supporting Ukraine. We feel it must be both. And in that there lies the small hope that we could bring to this situation. Okay.
Thank you both for your fascinating insights. Let me, just before I turn it over to questions, ask you one, and it relates to just what's happened. Dave,
Yeah.
you talked about don't back them into a corner.
Yeah.
You now have a situation of where Ukraine has attacked Russia on Russian territory.
Yeah.
What does this make of his warning that he would use all means at his disposal to defend Russian territory? Does this represent the kind of escalation that can easily get out of control? Is he bluffing, or does he have to act?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bluff. I think it's very, very, very concerning to me as I listen to this, because I think it does threaten, attack on Russian territory does threaten more an experience of humiliation. I'm very worried. I'm very worried, and I can understand the Ukraine's desire to do that, because a lot of the stuff that's coming at them is coming out of Russia, indeed, and coming out of these bases. I can understand they're wanting to do that, but I am very, very worried. And I would think that we would have to redouble our diplomatic efforts to try to try to do what, at least to be in touch. I certainly don't have an easy answer for how to proceed on that. Chuck, did you have any thought about that?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the word bluff, Forik. The war is going in favor of Ukraine. The facts on the ground are in favor of Ukraine, and I suspect I'm surprised by this news. Frankly, I would not have thought that Zelensky would take the risk of sending drones to attack targets well inside, as you said, the report was hundreds of miles in Russia. It is militarily provocative, and certainly he must feel that it will aid the military effort in general. But it is very, very risky and very provocative, because it stands to exacerbate the humiliation of the Russian forces, who are, every day for the ever since February 24th, they've been losing basically one battle after another. They've been retreating, and they lost the big battle for Kyiv. And now they're retreated to the far east of the country. The Donbass is no longer secure. So what my suspicion is that Zelensky doesn't really believe that Putin would take the extraordinary risk of using nuclear weapons. The problem is, you can't play with nuclear weapons the way you
It could be a gross miscalculation.
It could be a gross miscalculations. Yeah, it's terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, on that terrifying note, you take questions. If you raise your hands, you take them as they come.
And of course, that's what happens in war. These gross miscalculations happen all the time, unfortunately.
You have questions?
There's a question from Sarah Powers. Sarah, could you unmute and ask your question, and I'll check in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I had two. I hope you guys can hear me. I have two questions, if that's all right. So my first question was regarding the actual methods that you use when conducting this sort of research, because I love reading things like this, like analyzing important political figures. But I always wonder, and I hope this doesn't sound like a loaded question, I'm like legitimately wondering what do you use to conduct this research? What I mean by that is, say, like a public speech, you know, obviously Putin may not be honest in what he's saying, but then the same's true for individuals he's talking to. So I was just curious, exactly what do you choose to cite and really see as like when he's speaking, like when he's being honest and vulnerable, and how do you differentiate that? Yes.
Can I answer? Should I answer that?
You said you had two questions.
No, what's the other?
Correct. Yeah. Do you want me to ask the other one right now?
Yeah, sure. And then
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. So I was also wondering, like, in regards to whoever the oligarchs or whoever it is besides Putin that are still needed for his regime to still exist, how exactly is he keeping loyalty instilled in these people, that assuming he has even done that at this point? Is it just a simple matter of that he's been there for so long, he's just basically surrounded by yes men, or yeah? And that was my other question. Thank you.
You want me to take a stab at that? You, John?
Go ahead.
In terms of the data that we use, obviously this is one of the criticisms of this kind of theorizing. And you don't have Putin on the couch. You've never interviewed the man. You have no direct understand. You have no direct inner data. However, and it's true. But we do have a lot of information about his behavior and what he talks about. And furthermore, and actually we do also know something about the circumstances of his childhood development, which is replete with abandonment and trauma and humiliation, by the way, again, from an external point of view. So what we have are the patterns of behavior and his articulated thought. Now, that doesn't mean that we know precisely, was it these kinds of circumstances with his mother who left him and etc. No, we don't know that, but we can see how he behaves. And these patterns are not only characteristic of him, but they are characteristic of other historical figures like Hitler, like Kutub in Egypt, etc. There are common elements both in the thought and in their behavior of these various leaders. So we draw some understanding of. It's a speculation of the nature of the inner experience. Now, we with that, we also have the data of our clinical experience with people who suffer these ways. So there's a combination of the understanding derived from our clinical work with patients and the patterns that we observe out of that clinical work, and then at the application of the patterns that we've derived from the clinical work to the behaviors and historical patterns that we see. Does that help you understand where?
Let me add to that, because
Go ahead.
I
Sure,
had
go ahead.
the experience in the 1990s of going into a religious fundamentalist community for really 5 years, and that the report of that study is my book Apocalypse on the Psychology of Fundamentalism in America, and that's where it was based on literally hundreds of interviews and 25 individuals where I followed a very, very careful social psychological model developed by Robert J. Lifton, who worked on survivors of Hiroshima and survivors of the war and many other circumstances, historical events and catastrophes. But that was raw interview material, and it was a result of that study of religious fundamentalism that I anyway came up with these categories, the significance of the dualism, of the millennialism, the apocalypticism, of the paranoia, and other criteria that really define psychologically what we're talking about in the fundamentalist mindset. And then over a 15-year dialogue with my friend David Terman, we've enlarged that to into this realm that is now we're thinking about in relationship to Putin. So I think it's a method. It's obviously a qualitative method, but it's a method which is quite robust in terms of thinking about these very difficult contemporary situations where we need a psychological, we need a political, we need a historical, we need all kinds of perspectives on current events like this and on this war, but we also need a psychological understanding.
I would add it further, Chuck. I think there was a convergence between your empirical experience with the fundamentalists and my clinical theoretical orientation, which really drove me to the formulation of the paranoid gestalt. It was really a combination of both my clinical work and which was not with fundamentalists, but with people who had narcissistic injury and paranoid formations out of that narcissistic injury. It was really a kind of a confluence between that experience and my theorizing about it and your empirical experience in which we really developed some of these ideas.
Just a word, yes, but we're like John and Paul and the Beatles, right? Where they could sing a note and suddenly look at each other and suddenly a song would emerge, right? That's the method, right? The other question was about instilling loyalty. The key characteristic of the paranoid leader is absolute certainty. That, of course, is their undoing, the source of their undoing. But as long as they can stay in power, the question was sort of how does he instill loyalty among his followers? Well, he does it, and including the group, and the group self is a psychological, not a sociological idea, but the paranoid leader presents with absolute certainty. They know the big picture. They know what history is all about. They know the future of the group of Russia. They can see, they have this millennial vision. They present themselves as the carrier of ultimate salvation. That, of course, is exactly, that's the source of their power, but that's the source of their undoing. And in this case, the invasion of Ukraine.
There's another aspect to that power I would like to add, and that is the unhesitating use of cruelty and abuse that they will use on anyone who is perceived as countering this certain utopian vision. So it's the combination of the certainty and the knowledge and the unhesitating use of cruelty and force to counter anything that counters them. Trump, that and certainly Putin.
I have a question. I want to know if you have also invested any of your research and deep research, right, into the psychic of the foil, in this case, the other side. It is absolutely inconceivable to me that Zawinski would have done what he did today if it wasn't the West checking the box. Somewhere in the West, not the NATO High Command, but certainly there's intelligence on the ground that has known that this was in the works probably for days. And you say that Putin's or Russia's invasion into Ukraine was unprovoked. My question is, have you done the research to substantiate that it was unprovoked? He obviously was provoked. They were provoked in certain ways. And I think that we are victims of the Western media and what we get fed. I mean, I try don't have great access to what Russians are saying or doing about this, but to know enough that that there is a lot of Russian interests that are just not loyal Putin fans, so to speak, Putin files, that absolutely believe that there was a NATO creep, so to speak, that wasn't slow. It seems that in some ways we in the West have created this iconic figure around Zawinski, and don't really look at him. I mean, he doesn't seem to me to be any real true Democrat. If you look at his party affiliations, but that's yet to be seen whether we'll see what he comes to be in terms of his political leadership in the future, should this be settled in some way. But that's my question. I mean, I would assume that Putin examines the psychic of his enemies, just like you're doing of him. And so he got it wrong somehow, you seem to say. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he wants to use that nuclear arsenal and figured that he would be provoked to doing it. I don't know, but I'm interested in knowing what you think of that.
I do have some thoughts on that. I mean, I think there's no question that there was NATO creep. I think there's no question that the Ukraine was moving and has been moving for a long time, certainly since the 1990s, toward the West. And as in other countries in that area, I mean, I think there's been not only a political, but also a cultural yearning to be part of the West. You know, the American and Western European culture is very compelling, and I think that the NATO creep was a uncritical series of moves over many years to bring Ukraine into the Western orbit. And I think there's no question that there was an insensitivity to the to the way in which that would be perceived by Russia as an encroachment. That's and I think all of that's true. That doesn't mean that the invasion and starting a war is an appropriate response to that NATO creep, and encroaching. I think it psychologically, as we argued in our talk, it was a wildly exaggerated response to what was a real threat. A real threat to their dominance in Ukraine and other areas of the whole area of East Central Europe, and particularly to respond with a major invasion, and then to threaten using nuclear weapons in order to respond to that encroachment.
I just want us to capture a few of these questions that are in the chat, and then we'll come back to those who have raised hands here. There's a question from David Gorfin. He says, what do you think would have happened if the US stayed out of this, meaning the war in Ukraine?
Do you want to give people a chance to ask a number of questions and raise issues, and
well, we have a number of
respond to everything, but
we have a number of them already in the chat. Do you want to respond to this one now, or should we take another one?
Take some others too.
Okay, so that's David Gorfin's question. What do you think would have happened if the US stayed out of this? Then there's David Belton. David, do you want to go ahead and raise your question on mute and ask?
Hi, yes, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, my question is, you mentioned Tim Snyder, and he's obviously been a fascinating person for anyone interested in Ukraine to be reading over the last few months. And I was intrigued by something that he'd said only a few weeks ago, that and I suppose it's rather focusing on what I'm fascinated to hear you guys talking about this evening. Well, in my evening anyway. That his worries, he cautions against the obsession that we in the West have for Putin, and not spending enough time thinking about all the other power brokers that exist within Russia, who are people that we should be and probably are negotiating with and having secret talks with in terms of trying to undermine the position that Putin has taken. And my question then, if that is what's going on, and I'm sure it probably is what is the effect on, from your experience and your analysis of Putin, to the idea that there are other forms of communication going on with other power elements within the Russian power structure, be it Wagner Group or be it the oligarchs or whoever you want to pick. How does that play on someone like Putin?
Well, to talk about that, I think that the degree that he becomes aware of that increases his anxiety and his anger. But I guess one of the questions is, practical questions is, can in our negotiations with these other people, or in trying to interfere in some way, could these people overthrow Putin? And maybe they could, and of course we don't know whether that would make things better or worse, because some of those people would be probably maybe even less restrained, maybe, or others would not. I don't know. I certainly don't know. But I think to any degree that he would become aware of this would only increase his anxiety and his need to retaliate. Do you have any thought about that, John?
Yeah, I mean, it's a deeply corrupt regime, and those other power structures, particularly the oligarchs, but also the other power structures, are held in check by being able to feed off through corruption to keep them pacified and satisfied by dispensing with the oil wealth to bring them, buy them off, and the cost is not to dissent in any way. all of this is speculative because we're in the middle of it. We won't really know for 30 years kind of what really is going on. The worrisome thing is that if Putin were, one of the many worrisome things about this situation is that if Putin were to fall, it's not entirely clear that that worse, more aggressive, more paranoid power centers would come to power, more right-wing extremism who would have no question at all about using nuclear weapons. So that those other structures, I mean, talk about the obsession with Putin, it's in the nature of autocracy that they tend to centralize, they have enormous centralization of power, which is right now is what we're dealing with. But he could well be overthrown by people who are more right-wing than he is, more apocalyptic and more millennial.
Okay, let's take a few more questions here. We'll Dini Dozy and then Dietrich, and then I'll go back to the chat and get a few more of these questions and or comments.
Thank you, Chris. Mine is a quick question going back to your original title, Inside Putin's Head. What about Inside Hitler's Head? And so my question really asks you to compare and contrast Putin and Hitler. Thank you.
Yeah, but in the interest of time, I actually had a whole section of our talk that dealt with the Hitler and the interest of, because I saw we were going on too long, so I cut that out. Yeah, no, Hitler in some ways is the gold standard of what we're talking about with the fundamentalist mindset and with
He is well known.
Can you mute now, please?
Absolutely a millennial vision from early on, the 1,000-year Reich. I mean, what is the 1,000-year Reich? This is a millennial dream. And it was not loose rhetoric. This was essential to Hitler's vision of the future. That was the point of killing all, life unworthy of life, so-called, and of which most of all included the Jews, but also other minorities, gypsies, other groups, homosexuals, political, but Jews most of all. And it was an apocalyptic project. In other words, it wasn't killing a lot of Jews or most Jews. The whole point was to kill every single Jew, that somehow that would realize this 1,000-year Reich. And therefore you start a war. And he did start a war, and invaded Poland, much to the surprise. Well, I don't know. Some people weren't that surprised, but it was, he unleashed this unbelievably huge war with tens of millions of people died. But there was a point. It wasn't just territorial aggrandizement. It was a millennial vision to realize. I don't think you can begin to understand Adolf Hitler unless you appreciate the intensity or the meaning of the mixture of his paranoia with his sense of making the war in order to realize this millennial vision. And David, summarized very well the impact of Ilion. I mean, maybe you want to say something else about that, David, with Putin, about the impact of Ilion.
Well, yes, I could say that, but it's interesting. I think that the characters, the inner workings of these men, and they are men. We haven't found any women in history yet who do this sort of thing. It's stereotypic. There's the history of childhood humiliation and abuse. Hitler's father was petty bureaucrat who demeaned and tortured the dog, summoned Hitler with a dog whistle. The history of humiliation and abuse was astonishing. He also had an undescended testicle, which was a further narcissistic injury to Hitler. And so and he was rejected by the art school in Vienna, etc. All along the way, there were humiliations and abuses. The same is true of Putin, to the degree that we know. We know less about Putin's early life, but there are indications that this kind of more abandonment and humiliation, both by family and by peers, that he was seen as weak. So we with them there are these histories. The same is true of Kutub in Egypt, and so when you go from one to the other, you see again and again these histories of traumatic abuse in their development, and then the same kind of psychological mindset. That is, we will Stalin, I don't know about Stalin's early life, but certainly Stalin conformed to this structure as an adult, where we will establish the perfect world, the workers' paradise, and exterminate anyone who stands in the way. Stalin, Kutub, Hitler, Putin, they all have this millennial view of what they're going to establish, this utopian view, and the same impetus to eliminate, exterminate anybody who would stand in the way, which really again becomes the means of establishing the perfect world. The elimination becomes the means of doing it. They all do that. They all feel the same way. We don't have them on the couch, but their behaviors and their thinking is you could substitute almost one from the other. And we have Ilyin on the one hand, who's talking about perfect Russia and the evil West, and then you have Mein Kampf on the other, where the Germans, like some earlier German thought, have been compromised by the Jew who has infected the German Reich, and they have to be eliminated. That, by the way, those ideas were also prevalent in Germany, by the way, in the mid-19th century. Where Germany was seen as being contaminated by the Jews who should be exterminated like lice. It didn't take hold, however. It didn't take hold in Germany until after World War I, when Germany was humiliated. Those ideas didn't become part of the whole German fabric because Germany was ascendant, powerful, and it didn't have the blows to its national pride that happened with World War I. But anyway, yes, they're all, they seem to be of a piece. You could almost substitute one for another, but with the particular historical circumstances that each of them develops from.
Okay, Dietrich.
Thank you. I just wanted to briefly address a point that we haven't focused much time on, but a little bit in the middle of the presentation. And that is, there's a lot of hand-wringing that there are no solutions to this problem that we have, and that things could get much worse before they get real bad or so. What a solution that is being proposed for the Ukraine as to how to evolve out of this conflict is a sort of a Marshall Plan that will rebuild the economy and well, all the infrastructure that has been demolished and will continue to be demolished more and more, and that will bring the Ukraine out of the dismal situation that it is in now. A solution might be to extend the offer for a Marshall Plan to include actually Russia also, as the economy of Russia is not that of a world power. It's about the size of Italy. And it might be a good off-ramp for Putin if something could be proposed to him that the aid that it's going to solve this whole war will go to both the Ukraine and to Russia, and that Putin then can point to an option or to an off-ramp under which he could actually start to negotiate well, I wanted to put that forward as a solution. It might also have to include China, which of course is bordering Russia to Russia's east. But if the world powers look at this together and make positive proposals for a solution where somebody like Putin could point to that actually this could be a benefit for them, that we might actually find an off-ramp for him to resolve this whole problem.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful idea. I do think it's a wonderful idea. How it could be implemented at this point, I don't know. And I think it would have been a really terrific idea if we had done it with the collapse of the Soviet Union. If we had been able to have some kind of a Marshall Plan, some kind of real assistance to their transition. But I think that's a terrific idea
I completely agree. It's a wonderfully hopeful idea, and it avoids by imagining a Marshall Plan that would include Ukraine but also Russia. It would dissolve the threat that Russia seems to, at least Putin seems to feel from Ukraine, and so it would move toward a much more hopeful kind of a world in Eastern Europe, and it's a wonderful off ramp. We have to be sensitive, as Macron as rightly said. A solution that ends up humiliating Putin is not a good one. We may not like it, but we have to recognize that. And I think Macron has had to back off some from his emphasis on that. But I think it's very psychologically astute. And what you were suggesting, Dietrich, it would do exactly that. The other thing is that
too bad that it's 30 years too late, but it's a terrific.
Well, yeah, but we're in the middle of a war, so yeah, we need some sort of solution to the war, right?
Right.
Wait, you're muted.
You're
muted. Well, I mean, I believe there are sufficient. If it's being brought up, I mean, sometimes you don't find the door in the dark, but there is a door, and it's one. You're right. The big opportunity was to accomplish that, to really help at the Soviet Union at that time and Gorbachev to get a benefit from tearing down that wall in Berlin and so forth, was missed by not really getting the Soviet Union and then the evolving Russia involved in all the benefits that the end of the Cold War brought to the rest of the world.
Right.
And this might be a second time that and there are enough people, I think, certainly in Europe. If you talk to an Andrea Merkel, for example, if you followed her policies of engaging Russia in a dialogue and also into some economic incentives of developing Russia. I mean, its only industry that it really has is the exploiting of national resources. It doesn't have the kind of industry that we have in the United States, where you have, venture capital investments in, billions of dollars going into new economies and so forth that employ thousands of people, etc. Russia doesn't have that. It doesn't have that capital to do that. And it is something that would have to come from the outside. And there are people I know from Europe, also from the United States. I think it would be there would be quite a few people consider something like that that would support something like that.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
For Merkel,
okay?
she gets criticized for having done that, but that maybe she had, it just didn't come out her way.
Thank you.
Okay,
We have
Chris, one more question. And that's it. We have to wrap it up.
There are a couple more. Is Marcy? Would you come online and ask that question?
But you're muted, Marcy.
Sorry. Okay. My question was simply, would any of the three of you have comments on what President Macron's strategy might be with Putin, which is to say the ongoing conversations that actually you, Chuck, just addressed in response to Diedrich's comments, but I posted this earlier, but the idea being to the long-range goal of Putin's singular megalomania, I've described it as, since the collapse of the wall in 1989, Putin has been focused, it seems, on healing from his narcissistic injury. Remember, he was in the basement in the furnace with the furnace burning all of the documents there, but he couldn't get a response from Moscow and so forth. So in other words, is part of Macron's strategy to acknowledge that the long injury, well over 30 years now, for Putin requires first acknowledgement so any headway can be made. And I think that's been answered in the back and forth based on Diedrich's comments earlier, that it's a strategy that maybe bears some additional focus or consideration or of off-ramp was the word that was used. That was simply my question.
So we would agree with that. We would agree.
Yeah, no, and I think another hopeful thing, and as we wind up, we want to cling to hopeful things, and Dietrich's suggestion is grand, but it's very hopeful. But the other hopeful thing is Western leaders are pretty much in agreement going forward, so that the friendship between Biden and Macron, for example, is very real. And the leaders of other Western countries seem to be pretty much on the same page. That doesn't mean that they have a concrete solution yet, but they agree that Russia can't be humiliated. They agree that the war, that you can't make Ukraine cave in. And after all the tens of thousands of people who have suffered in this war, and they agree that some sort of collective solution is the only way to move forward. And I think the Western leaders are not split, and that's encouraging. that they're going to, as they move forward and try to come up with creative solutions, that at this point, at least, it doesn't seem that they're going to be divided. You know, Putin is not going to be able to divide and conquer, split off Germany or Western Europe or the United States, you know, and use oil as a weapon. I mean, there are all the ways that a wily leader, megalomaniac, maniacal leader, as you say, will try to manipulate the situation to his advantage. I don't think that'll work on this one.
I think it's good to remember too that Putin grew up in post Stalingrad, after 1 million people had died of lack of food, and he talks about how they would kind of chase rats, and they eat rats or something that were edible. He has this rat analogy: don't put a rat in a corner, it will attack you.
Right.
He uses it very deliberately. So I don't know whether to end on that note. It's a 6:30, but now it's the rat cornered as a result of what has happened in the last couple of hours. And I want to thank you both ever so much for an incredibly stimulating conversation that I hope throws some insight for all of us who read what is happening and try to make sense of it, so we have a little better understanding of the dynamics involved. Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Dave. And thank you all for tuning in. I know some of you are doing so from abroad, from the UK or from Nigeria, I believe. We have a couple of people listening, and from as far down as Brazil. So you have a global audience.
Thank you, Poreg, for organizing
Good
that.
night to everybody. And
And
thank
let's
you ever
thank
so
you,
much.
Parag, as well for hosting
Yes.
and making this an inaugural event. Let's do it again, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for the honor. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.